Welcome to The Debate. Our discussion today, it really focuses on a central tension of the modern era. And that is, what is the capacity of an ordinary individual to navigate and resist powerful, large-scale deception? I mean, whether that involves sophisticated financial fraud or these pervasive information warfare campaigns we see everywhere.
And that tension is so palpable, isn't it? Because the speed of global information, the immense complexity of modern systems, financial, political, technological, it all just leaves people feeling completely powerless. So the core question we're addressing is this. Is the strength of individual and collective vigilance, critical thinking, ethical choices, activism, is that actually enough to counteract systemic deception and, well, unchecked ambition?
Exactly. And I argue that it is, that the aggregation of informed individual agency, the power of what you might call the citizen architect, is the ultimate most powerful bulwark against systemic corruption. The strength of the individual, when you multiply it, that's the ultimate check.
Hmm. I have to maintain a more pragmatic, perhaps skeptical, stance. I believe the sheer scale and, frankly, the suffocating sophistication of modern deception, which is backed by vast resources and deeply embedded systemic failures, too often just overwhelms or exploits or even actively neutralizes individual vigilance. It makes true, meaningful resistance nearly impossible.
I think the way to defeat engineered narratives is through informed action. When we really examine how these large-scale frauds and manipulations take root, the core insight is that transformative power truly resides in the aggregated, ethically guided choices of individuals. We have to start with a cognitive defense. That means mastering critical engagement, learning to differentiate misinformation from, say, disinformation, and actively seeking out diverse perspectives that challenge our own comfortable beliefs. And, we have historic proof that sustained, collective, bottom-up pressure, even small acts of defiance that add up over time, can dismantle entrenched structural power. You just have to think of the long-term, community-level organizing that underpinned the early civil rights movements. That is exactly what I mean by sustained vigilance. And besides that, contemporary technological innovation, from AI and machine learning tools used for real-time fraud detection to advanced digital forensics, it actually empowers the vigilant. It makes centralized secrecy structurally harder to maintain than it ever has been before.
I appreciate the focus on vigilance, I really do, but that idealism is precisely what I believe the system exploits. It overlooks the sheer, overwhelming sophistication of the deception blueprints being used today. These things are designed specifically to evade precisely that kind of detection. When we talk about these economic and corporate architects, they employ what I would call technological charlatanism, using proprietary black box technology or just outright faked scientific claims to create these illusions of stability or value. We see this acutely in complex financial schemes where they utilize off-balance sheet shell companies and manipulative accounting tricks. For instance, using mark-to-market valuations to wildly inflate profits. I mean, these are illusions that are meticulously constructed to fool expert auditors, let alone the individual consumer reading a news headline. And critically, individual choices are consistently crippled by cognitive biases. Deceptive narratives expertly leverage things like confirmation bias, telling people exactly what they want to believe, and the availability heuristic to push people toward extreme or simplified choices. Finally, the corruption it's utterly systemic. We see regulatory capture through the revolving door phenomenon, where former industry executives slide right into oversight roles. And this results in the intentional underfunding of oversight bodies and massive lobbying efforts that ensure the game is, completely rigged against the average person trying to exercise due diligence.
Okay, let's focus on your point about sophistication then. Can individual critical thinking overcome these engineered illusions? You suggest the systems are too complex, but complexity can be deconstructed.
It breaks down where the lie is weaponized and targeted not just at the public, but at professional gatekeepers. Consider the historical aggressive marketing of certain highly addictive substances. The companies involved, they armed sales representatives with these deceptive statistics claiming addiction rates were less than 1% for chronic pain patients. Now, that wasn't just a simple lie aimed at the general public. It was scientific-sounding misinformation targeted squarely at doctors, the very people we rely on for objective reasoned judgment. The illusion is maintained by making the deception seem legitimate through massive sponsored research and influence overriding public health warnings. So individual critical thinking is noble, but it's often insufficient against an engineered lie that's backed by scientific pretense and institutional endorsement.
I see why you think that. I do. But let me offer a different perspective. Even in the face of these sophisticated illusions, the collective commitment to critical engagement provides immense leverage. I mean, think about the historical precedent of intelligence operations. The code breakers who used multidisciplinary expertise to crack so-called impenetrable ciphers, they weren't geniuses working in isolation. They were a collective applying systemic thinking. Today, that translates not just to debunking the lie, but to crowdsourcing transparency. It means applying digital forensics to demand proof and challenging narratives that consistently downplay risks while heavily promoting unrealistic benefits. And if we talk about this psychological levers you mentioned, we have to understand them not as some inescapable fate, but as design flaws in the human operating system that we can guard against. So if the availability heuristic means we over-rely on easily recalled examples, then the solution is for us to actively seek out data that counters the most accessible narrative.
That's an interesting point about crowdsourcing, but I would frame the psychological exploitation differently. The success of those sophisticated deceptions wasn't just about the lie itself. It was about exploiting a fundamental human desire, the addiction to the quick fix, the promise of effortless wealth. Financial schemes, particularly massive Ponzi webs, they don't fail because people can't do math. They thrive on an intoxicating allure, using a facade of opulence and high-pressure sales to bypass rational skepticism. It's about making people want the deception to be true. When you mention confirmation bias, that's absolutely key. They don't have to convince you of a new truth. They just have to confirm your deeply held, often simplistic belief. Whether that's that the government is hiding everything, or that you, unlike others, have found the secret path to early retirement.
These aren't intellectual failings that a quick check of the facts can solve. They are fundamental exploitations of psychological vulnerability.
You brought up mark-to-market valuations earlier, and that is a perfect example of a mechanism designed to exploit desire. For listeners who might be unfamiliar, you're talking about an accounting method where, instead of valuing an asset based on its historical purchase price, it's valued based on what someone thinks it's worth on the open market today, even if there isn't actually an active market.
Exactly. It's the illusion of value. It allows companies to effectively book imaginary profits and pretend everything is fine until the entire illusion just collapses. And it relies on everyone in the chain, auditors, investors, regulators, wanting to believe the number is real.
But surely that leads us directly to the question of accountability versus legal insulation. You painted a bleak picture of the systemic enablers, the revolving door, these complex financial schemes. But don't we see the facade cracking more quickly now thanks to individual efforts?
The facade cracks, I agree, but what's the result? A massive fine on the corporation, while the individuals involved walk away relatively unscathed.
But the growing power of whistleblowers and investigative journalists proves the illusion cannot last indefinitely. Their individual bravery, often facing immense legal threats and, psychological tolls, it exposes the cracks in the facade that eventually lead to prosecution. And furthermore, new technologies like AI and machine learning are fundamentally changing oversight. They're shifting audits from reactive, episodic reviews performed years after the fact to continuous, real-time monitoring of transactions and anomalies. That makes it structurally much harder to sustain fraud over time.
I'm sorry, I just disagree that the systems are truly adapting fast enough to close that gap. The game of financial whack-a-mole is still heavily weighted toward the mole.
Go on.
Well, let me elaborate on the legal insulation. When accountability finally arrives, the perpetrators are shielded by vast wealth, employing incredibly complex legal evasion strategies. They use shell corporations, often based in different jurisdictions, combined with offshore trusts and strategic asset transfers specifically designed to shield personal fortunes from corporate liabilities. So what we get is partial, often inadequate justice, vast fines levied on the company, which often just means shareholders suffer, while the individuals retain their wealth and influence. And the global nature of these crimes just makes accountability a nightmare. Look at the immense jurisdictional complexity of tracking international financial plunder. Whether it's money laundering or environmental crimes committed in international waters, authorities struggle with legal vacuums and conflicting national laws. Global fugitives can escape true reckoning simply by hopping from one friendly jurisdiction to the next, living in luxurious exile while legal bodies struggle to even coordinate.
That's a powerful indictment of the system itself. I grant you, the revolving door and the jurisdictional complexity, but the solution lies in recognizing that these systems are subject to political will. Every choice an individual makes, to support independent oversight, to advocate for ethical policy, or to choose a career aligned with integrity, that slowly chips away at that insulation. When we talk about regulatory capture, the revolving door, we need to address it politically. That means the collective action of voters demanding transparency and ethical stewardship forms the political mandate necessary to finally close those legal loopholes and strengthen regulatory frameworks. We can demand legislation that prevents executives from immediately moving into oversight roles governing their previous industry. The individual chooses to engage in that political battle.
But even if we chip away at regulatory loopholes, that brings us right back to the scale of impact, the micro versus the macro. Ethical consumerism and local activism are drops in an ocean compared to the systemic devastation wrought by unchecked ambition. Let's look at the human cost. We see the profound erosion of the social fabric, the generational trauma, and community destruction caused by large-scale deceptions like the opioid crisis, or the sudden devastating loss of life savings from massive corporate malfeasance. Individual action, however well-intentioned, choosing to buy an ethically sourced product or reading a deep analysis of a banking scheme, it often feels like a symbolic gesture when you're faced with such macroeconomic ruin and the sheer power of global financial alchemy.
For instance, if a global commodity trader operating across 5 different countries manipulates the price of grain, that single macro action can trigger famine or price shocks affecting millions. How does my personal choice to buy sustainable food counteract that level of systemic manipulation? It can feel futile.
That's a compelling argument regarding the scale. But have you considered the cumulative effect? The ripple effect proves that aggregated micro-decisions create macroscopic, lasting change. It's not about one person deciding to be critical. It's about millions of people making slightly better, more informed choices and doing it consistently. By consciously aligning personal consumer, media, and civic choices with our core values, we collectively shift market demand and cultural narratives. You mentioned the manipulation of commodity markets. Okay, well, if enough small institutional investors start demanding ESG, environmental, social, and governance compliance, that changes the flow of trillions of dollars in global capital. And that forces commodity traders to adapt or lose their funding. That pressure originates from individual choices aggregated into market trends. The true power isn't in a single grand protest. It's in a sustained, collective choice to engage, to move beyond passive observation to active participation in shaping policy and supporting ethical industries. This is the enduring strength that no single corporate structure, however wealthy, can indefinitely withstand. Because at the end of the day, they are fundamentally dependent on public trust and consumer capital.
I would push back on that, because the sheer momentum of these macro forces often dictates the micro choice. When a deceptive narrative or product is packaged and delivered with immense resources, say a multi-billion-dollar marketing campaign, it's not a fair fight for the individual consumer, no matter how vigilant they try to be. The sophisticated financial system is designed to accelerate wealth accumulation at the top, and in doing so, it creates such high economic anxiety for everyone else that they are psychologically predisposed to fall for the quick fix or the high-yield scam just to keep up. That's systemic exploitation, not individual failure.
But vigilance allows us to see the systemic exploitation for what it is. The citizen architect recognizes that the system is tilted, and the response isn't despair, it's coordinated counterpressure. Look at the rise of decentralized investigative models. Groups that use shared expertise to audit public documents or track asset transfers across borders. This collective capacity to generate facts and demand transparency A capability that only exists because individuals choose to participate is a counterweight that the centralized forces of deception simply cannot match in the long run.
The key difference, for me, remains the asymmetry of resources and time. The forces of deception have endless money, and they can wait out public attention spans. Vigilance requires continuous, draining effort from people who are already struggling under economic pressure.
So where does that leave us?
Well, our discussion, I think, illuminates the stark reality that the forces of deception are highly adaptable, they're well-funded, and they leverage deep systemic weaknesses and exploit human psychology to ensure their survival and insulation. And while vigilance is undeniably necessary for self-preservation, the current architecture of power and justice is inherently complex and often biased through legal insulation, ensuring that the pursuit of full accountability remains an agonizingly slow and often incomplete journey.
The path to justice is undeniably a labyrinth, I agree, filled with systemic barriers and psychological traps. But recognizing this truth is itself empowering. We agree on the severity of the threat, the twin addictions to power and profit that drive systemic deceit, but I remain convinced that by mastering critical thinking, building robust collective action, and strategically leveraging technological innovation, the individual citizen can and must be the architect of a more resilient future.
So the inherent tension between the scale of modern power and the reach of individual agency is not easily resolved. We hope this exchange provides listeners with a clearer view of the challenges ahead and the foundational principles needed to decide where their own efforts can best be placed. We encourage you to continue the vital work of discerning truth from illusion.